Hello and welcome to Once Upon a Time. Your friendly neighborhood librarians are here to read stories to you. I'm Catherine Poulter.
And I'm Becca, and we're so glad to be here.
And here we have some stories. I think this is the most wonderful time of year for knitting. It's a cozy time, and outside it can be cold and chilly, but inside holding nice warm wool in your hands and some sticks. Oh, that's so much fun. So I brought books that have to do with yarn and knitting, at least in some form. And the first one, is one of my favorites. This is called A Hat for Mrs. Goldman. It's a story about knitting and love. This book is by Michelle Edwards, and the pictures are by G. Brian Karras. A Hat for Mrs. Goldman. When Sophia was a tiny baby, Mrs. Goldman next door knit her a tiny baby hat to keep her warm. Now Sophia is big, and she makes the pom-poms for Mrs. Goldman's hats. Hats for the tiniest babies, hats for small, medium, and large friends and neighbors. Mrs. Goldman taught her how. Keeping keppies warm is our mitzvah, says Mrs. Goldman, kissing the top of Sophia's head. This is your kepi, and a mitzvah is a good deed. Sophia and Mrs. Goldman bundle up to walk Mrs. Goldman's dog, Fifi. Winter is almost here. Fifi wears her dinosaur sweater. Sophia wears her fuzzy kitten hat and matching mittens. Mrs. Goldman made them all. An icy wind blows Mrs. Goldman's hair left and right. It turns her ears pink. "Where's your hat?" asks Sophia. "I gave it to Mrs. Chen," she explains. Mrs. Goldman's kepi must be cold, worries Sophia. At home, Sophia thinks and worries again, worries and thinks. Mrs. Goldman needs a hat. Who will knit one for her? Not Mrs. Goldman. She's too busy knitting for everyone else. Last year, Mrs. Goldman taught Sophia how to knit. "I only like making pom-poms," decided Sophia, after a few days. "Knitting is hard, and it takes too long." Now Sophia digs out the knitting bag Mrs. Goldman gave her, and the hat they started. The stitches are straight and even. The soft wool smells like Mrs. Goldman's chicken soup. Sophia holds the needles and tries to remember what to do. She drops one stitch. She drops another. Still Sophia knits on. She wants to make Mrs. Goldman the most special hat in the world. The next day, when Sophia and Mrs. Goldman walk Fifi, tiny fluffs of snow fall on Mrs. Goldman's head. Her ears are bright red. Mrs. Goldman's kepi must be very cold, frets Sophia. Sophia knits after breakfast. She knits after lunch. She knits after dinner. She even knits while Mama reads her bedtime story. But Sophia doesn't knit when she is at Mrs. Goldman's house. The hat is a surprise. All week there's frost on the windows. One day when they are walking Fifi, Mrs. Goldman wraps Mr. Goldman's scarf around her head like she's a mummy. A fierce wind unwraps it and flings it up high. Sophia jumps and grabs the end of the scarf. Fifi nips on the other end. "Mrs. Goldman's kepi must be freezing," shivers Sophia. Sophia knits and knits and knits, faster and faster and faster, stitch by stitch, row by row. Then Sophia sews. At last, Mrs. Goldman's hat is done. Sort of. The hat is lumpy and bumpy. There are holes where there shouldn't be holes. It looks like a monster hat, thinks Sophia. Sophia turns the hat over and around, inside out. Mrs. Goldman's hat should not be a monster hat. That will scare Fifi. Sophia opens the box of hats Mrs. Goldman made for her. Each one is special, but they're all too small for Sophia now, and way too small for Mrs. Goldman. Sophia looks in the hall closet. There are hats Mrs. Goldman made for her Mama and Papa. She can't give their hats. There is a scratchy old hat Sophia's abuela wore back in Mexico. Worse than Mr. Goldman's scarf. Sophia thinks about Mrs. Goldman and the hats they make together. Your pom-poms add beauty, Mrs. Goldman always says. And that's a mitzvah too. Sophia feels her heart grow bigger and lighter, like a balloon. She searches her room for her red yarn. Red is Mrs. Goldman's favorite color. She gathers her scissors, her sewing needle, and her stack of index cards. Sophia gets busy, very busy. When Sophia is done, Mrs. Goldman's hat is the most special hat in the world. Sophia rushes next door. Surprise! For me? Asks Mrs. Goldman. For you, answers Sophia. It's a hat, she says. Of course it is, exclaims Mrs. Goldman, and she hugs Sophia, and then she cries. What's wrong? Asks Sophia. Don't you like it? I more than like it. I love it, declares Mrs. Goldman. Gorgeous. Like Mr. Goldman's rose bushes. And you know how I love his roses. Mrs. Goldman kisses Sophia on the top of her kepi. I made it all by myself, Sophia tells her. Amazing! And will you look at all these pom-poms? 1, 2, 3, 4 counts, Mrs. Goldman. Sophia joins in. There are 20 pom-poms on Mrs. Goldman's hat. Each one made with love. She gently puts her hat on. The next day, Sophia and Mrs. Goldman walk Fifi. Fifi wears her dinosaur sweater. Sophia wears her fuzzy kitten hat and matching mittens. Mrs. Goldman wears her Sophia hat. Her kepi is toasty warm, and that's a mitzvah. The end.
Oh,
I love that story.
Rosy pom-poms.
Yes.
There are pom-poms and there are cotton balls, woolly cotton balls, in this book titled Cotton Ball Colin by Jean Willis and Tony Ross. Let's read it. Cotton Ball Colin. Once there were 10 baby mice. 4 mice, they were big and bold and bouncy, all except Colin. Colin was the smallest. He was very, very small, even for a mouse. And there he is. His mother didn't worry about his brothers or sisters. They were big enough to look after themselves. But she worried about Colin. Small Colin. She was afraid he might get hurt, so she made him sit indoors quietly. She wouldn't let him climb or run or jump in case he fell. He couldn't go out in the spring in case he got wet, or summer in case he got hot, or autumn in case a chestnut fell on his head. By winter, Colin was very bored. He wanted to go out into the big, wide world. But his mother said no. The world is too big and too wide for you, Smalley. You should wrap Colin up in cotton, said Grandma. What a good idea, his mother thought. And that is exactly what she did. She wrapped him up round and round and round, so only his feet stuck out. Now he was Cotton Ball Colin. At last, he was allowed out, all wrapped up in cotton, safe from rain and sun and snow. If he fell, he would have a soft landing. If anything fell on him, he wouldn't feel it. Colin was as safe as could be. Or was he? Oh, look! A cotton ball, laughed a little boy. He picked Colin up and threw him, splosh, into the freezing river. Some of Colin's cotton came off. Oh, look! A piece of bread, quacked a duck. And it chased him. Peck, peck, peck. More cotton came off. Colin swam and swam. He climbed onto the bank, all bedraggled. Oh, look, a fat white rabbit, said a hungry fox, and it chased him. Snap, snap, snap. All of the cotton came off. Colin ran and ran and ran. He jumped down a hole and hid. The fox went away. Colin Smalley dried out in the sun. He skipped back home, feeling very large. His mother was horrified. Colin, where is your cotton? She shrieked. Anything could have happened to you. Everything did happen to me, he whooped. I got wet. I got cold. I got pecked. But I swam. I got chased. But I ran and I ran and I jumped and... Mama, I'm alive. I survived without the cotton. May I go out to play again tomorrow? His mother took a deep breath and said finally, yes, if you must, but take care. Take a coat, be good. Have fun. Love you, Smalley. So Colin went out into the great wide world. Sometimes he got scared and sometimes he got hurt. Tinkle, tinkle, there's the cat's bell. But it was worth it. The end.
Oh, that's so sweet. It's hard to let our children go out into the world.
The big world.
But they make their way. I found another great story about knitting. This is about a grandma who wants to knit some sweaters for her grandchildren. And it's called Leave Me Alone. It's by Vera Brosgol. And it's very clever. Leave me alone. Once, there was an old woman. She lived in a small village, in a small house, with a very big family. Winter was coming. That meant she had some very important knitting to do. But it wasn't getting done. Her grandchildren were very curious about her knitting. Were you supposed to hit the ball with a stick? Could you eat it? Could you make your brother eat it? Why did the ball get smaller and smaller when you chased it? The old woman was at the end of her rope. So she made her bed as neatly as she could. She swept the floorboards until they more or less shone. She drank tea from her samovar. She packed up her things in a big sack, and she left. And as she left, she shouted back, "Leave me alone!" The old woman walked through the deep, dark forest. She made a fire so that she could see what she was doing. Then she sat down and began to knit. The bear family was very curious about the light from her fire and about what she might taste like. "Leave me alone!" the old woman shouted, but they didn't listen because bears don't speak English. So she picked up her sack and left. The old woman climbed up the mountainside. It was cold, so she found a small sheltered place. Then she sat down and began to knit. The mountain goats were excited to have a visitor, especially one that brought snacks. "Leave me alone!" shouted the old woman. but the goats were too busy fighting over the red ones, which they all agreed were the best. So she picked up her sack and left. The old woman climbed higher and higher up the mountain. She reached the top and climbed onto the moon. She found a rock that was shaped like a chair. She sat down and began to knit. The little green moon men had never seen a woman before, old or otherwise. They examined her with handheld scanners that went beep boop. "Leave me alone!" shouted the old woman. But the little green moon men couldn't hear her because they didn't have any ears. So she picked up her sack and left through a wormhole. The void on the other side of the wormhole was very dark and very, very quiet. She was absolutely, completely, utterly alone. It was perfect. Soon she had no more yarn and 30 little sweaters. And she was alone. So she put the 30 sweaters into her big sack. She swept the void until it was a nice matte black. She had a cup of tea from her samovar. Then she picked up the sack and left through another wormhole. Ta-da! When she came out of the other side, everything was right where she left it. And she didn't say a word. The end.
I think I want to climb to the moon and go through a wormhole.
Yes.
We are going to read a book about penguins and problems. This is called Penguin Problems by Jory John and Lane Smith. A sad penguin. It is way too early. My bed is cold. What's with all this squawking, you guys? It snowed some more last night, and I don't even like the snow. It's too bright out here. I'm hungry. I'd like a fish. Where are all the fish? Hey, fish, get out here. The ocean smells too salty today. I'm not buoyant enough. I sink like a dumb rock. It's way too dark down here. Brr. I said brr. Oh, great, a leopard seal. Oh, great, a shark. Oh, great, an orca. What is with this place? I don't like being hunted. I'm still hungry, but my flippers ache. I waddle too much. I look silly when I waddle. See? Waddle, waddle, waddle. I wish I could fly, but I can't. See? Flap, 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 flap. Everybody looks the same as me. I look the same as everybody else. Mom? I literally have no idea who you are. Dad? I literally have no idea what you're talking about. My name is Mortimer. I have so many problems, and nobody even cares. Excuse me, sir? What? Good afternoon. I sense that today has been difficult, but lo, look around you, penguin. Have you noticed the way the mountains are reflected in the ocean like a painting? Have you gazed upon the blue of that cloudless winter sky, my friend? Have you felt the sun as it gently warms your back? Have you simply stood with your penguin brothers and sisters and elders who adore you? Yes, Some things are challenging out here. Yes, we all have difficult moments, from the walrus to the polar bears, from the whales to the penguins. But hear me now, my new friend. I wouldn't trade my life for any other, and I am quite sure you wouldn't either. I am certain that when you think about it, you'll realize that you are exactly where you need to be. Please think about what I've said, Penguin. Goodbye for now. Who the heck was that guy? Why do strangers always talk to me? Walruses don't understand penguin problems. Okay. Maybe that walrus has a point. After all, I do love the mountains. And the ocean. And the sky. And I have friends and family. This is my only home. And this is my only life. Maybe things will work out after all. My beak is cold. It gets dark way too early. The end. Oh, those problems.
That's funny.
So many.
So many problems. Well, this next knitting story is about a boy who is knitting. It's called Knit Your Bit, a World War I story. It's by Deborah Hopkinson and illustrated by Stephen Gornaccia. Here are some actual photographs of boys and girls knitting for the soldiers in the First World War. Here we go. Knit Your Bit. When Pop left to be a soldier, I wanted to go with him. I'm brave, I told Pop. I know, Mikey, he said, patting my shoulder, and you'll need to be, 'cause it takes just as much courage to stay behind. Back home, Mama pulled out her knitting needles. Our soldiers will be cold come winter. Teach me, Ellie begged. I want to help. What about you, Mikey? Mama asked, fishing out more needles. No way. Boys don't knit, I said. Besides, I want to do something big to help. Ellie finished her first hat a few days later. It wasn't much to look at, but she wrapped it up to send to Pop right away. You could knit him something too, Mikey. Like I said, sis, knitting is for girls. No, it's not, Ellie cried, grabbing the newspaper. Everyone's helping. Look at these firemen, and even President Wilson keeps sheep on the White House lawn for wool. Ellie turned the page. Our boys need socks. Knit your bit. If we each do a little, it makes something big, she said. I just rolled my eyes. A few days later, Miss Robin tacked a poster on the bulletin board. Wouldn't it be great if students from our class entered the knitting bee? Mrs. Robin asked. All the boys, including me, jeered. This is what the poster says. It says, Central Park Knitting Bee. Individual and group speed knitting. Prizes for the best. Hats, socks, scarves. 3 days of knitting for our soldiers in need. 50 cents entry fee. Mikey, you're always talking about how brave you are, Sarah said. This is your chance to help. But I bet you're scared you can't learn. Me? Scared? My friends and I can beat you any day. Mikey, sit down, Nick hissed. Dare you to enter, the girls cried all together. It's a deal, boys against the girls. We'll call our team the Boys Knitting Brigade. I thought that sounded big and important enough. Fine, said Josie. We'll be the Pearl Girls. Pearl Girls? I didn't even know what pearl meant. I gulped. What had I gotten into? Mama offered to give us lessons. Nick and Dan came over every day after school to practice. After we'd figured out how to hold our needles and knit, which was hard enough, Mama even showed us how to purl. Nick was the major of mufflers. I was the sergeant of socks, which are not easy, believe me, especially the heels. As for Dan, well, mostly his yarn just got tangled. Our cat loved it. Finally, the day of the knitting bee arrived. Central Park was a sea of women and men, old and young, and lots of girls. "Forward, march," I commanded. "Mikey, we're the only boys," whispered Nick. "I sure hope we don't get laughed out of here." "Look at that food. When do we eat?" Dan asked. "Those sausages smell delicious." "Over here, boys," called Miss Robin. Naturally, the Pearl girls were ready to go. Sarah smiled sweetly, but she was all business. "Get ready to be beaten by the fastest knitters in New York City." I led my troop to a nearby bench. "Ignore those girls, soldiers. Speed isn't everything. There are prizes for the best knitting, too." We unraveled our yarn and grabbed our needles. The band struck up a rousing march. Drummers beat tin buckets with knitting needles, of course. Rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat. Cast on! My men performed with courage, mostly. Dan came close to deserting us for the food tables, and Nick got distracted watching Mrs. Rizzo's flying fingers. She won a prize for knitting a sweater, 5 hours and 45 minutes exactly. We knit all afternoon and the next day too. By the third day, the pressure was on. Dan's piece looked more like an old dish rag than a hat. Nick was still clicking away, though the edges of his muffler were all zaggedy because he kept adding stitches or dropping them. I'd finished one sock yesterday. Now I was on my second. I was feeling pretty good. That first sock was definitely my best yet. Maybe I'd even win a prize for the pair if I could get the second one done by the end of the day. Ellie offered to bring me some lunch, but I shook my head. "Oh, you're doing so good, Mikey. Let me see." Ellie gave a little gasp. "Oh no, Mikey, look," she whispered. "A hole. You dropped a stitch right at the beginning there." Somehow I'd missed it, but Ellie was right. To make it perfect, I'd have to rip the whole sock apart and start over again. I hung my head. Knitting was stupid. I felt like breaking my needles and stomping on everything. "Nice work, kid." I glanced up. A young soldier stood before me. He nodded toward my one perfect sock on the bench. "Thank you, sir," I stammered. I was still feeling miserable, but I'm really not so good at this. "Well, you're trying, aren't you? That's what counts." We were silent a minute. "You got someone over there?" "Yes, sir. My dad," I told him. All at once I missed Pop so much my eyes stung. I wondered where he was. I could almost see him hiding in a muddy ditch or shivering in the rain. How could anything I do, little or big, really help? "Warm wool socks would have felt mighty cozy last winter," the soldier said. "So you keep on knitting, kid. I bet your dad will be real glad to wear those socks." "Yes, sir." I wasn't sure what to do next, so I stood and saluted. Then I took the sock apart and began again. "Needles down!" Sarah had finished a muffler. Molly had made a pair of socks. And Josie's hat was perfect. "Now let's see how you did," said Sarah. For a minute we stood in silence. Finally Dan said, "I guess my yarn got a little greasy from the sausages." We all laughed. I held out my hand to Sarah. "You beat us fair and square." "No hard feelings, Mikey." "Nah, just wait till the next time." I never did finish that pair of Central Park knitting bee socks. Instead, just before we left, I got up my courage and found the young soldier. "This is for you." I held out my best ever perfect sock. "Gee, thanks, kid," he said, "and don't give up." "I won't," I promised. As for what happened after that, well, Nick and Dan never went near knitting needles again. But all by herself, Ellie made hats for every soldier in Pop's unit. They sent her a picture of themselves. As for me, I did keep trying, and though I took a while, I finally knit a pair of socks for Pop. He wrote back to say they were his favorite. He promised to wear them on the day he came home. And he did. And then if you check this book out from the library, you can read a little bit more about knitting, and you can see the real pictures of the sheep on the White House lawn, of the boys knitting, and all of this. The end.
That's really fun history. I enjoyed
like
that so
that.
much. Have you ever wondered what happens to all of our animal friends in the chilly winter cold? What they're doing under the blanket? Let's see. There's a hidden world under the snow. Under the Snow, written by Melissa Stewart, illustrated by Constance B. Burgum. In the heart of winter, a deep layer of snow blankets fields and forests, ponds and wetlands. You spend your days sledding and skating and having snowball fights, but under the snow lies a hidden world. Under the snow, in a field, dozens of ladybugs pack themselves into a gap in an old stone wall. Below them, a snake rests in a hole all its own. Voles spend their days tunneling through the snow, and when they find a young tree, they slowly strip off layers of bark and eat them. Below the ground, a chipmunk snoozes for a few days at a time. Between naps, it snacks on the nuts and seeds stored in its burrow. Under the snow is a forest. A morning cloak butterfly takes cover in a pile of brush. Inside a rotting log, a centipede and a bumblebee queen remain silent and still until spring. Just below the ground, a spotted salamander waits out the coldest months of the year. Deeper down, a woodchuck sleeps soundly all winter long. Its heart rate drops and its breathing slows. The animal gets all the energy it needs from its thick layer of fur and fat. Under the snow on a pond, bluegills circle slowly through the chilly water. They don't have enough energy to chase the water boatman swimming nearby. A carp rests quietly on the muddy bottom. It isn't even tempted by the water striders lying just a few inches away. Buried in the mud, a frog and a turtle wait out the winter. They never move, and they barely breathe. Under the snow in a wetland, a beaver family huddles together inside a cozy log lodge. When they get hungry, they swim to their food storage pile and munch on some sticks. But even on the coldest winter days, red spotted newts dodge and dart, whiz and whirl just below the ice. As time passes, the sun's rays slowly grow stronger. Each day is a little bit longer. Animals living in fields and forests, ponds and wetlands begin to get ready for spring. And so do you. The end.
Oh, that's a beautiful book.
I like that book a lot.
That's beautiful.
Very beautiful.
I have another story about a sweater. This is called The Truly Terribly Horrible Sweater That Grandma Knit. It's by Debbie McComber and Mary Lou Carney. The pictures are by Vincent Nguyen. The truly terribly horrible sweater that Grandma knit. Only 3 more days until my birthday, Cameron Girard thought as he raced in the door from soccer practice and kicked off his cleats. That's when he saw it. Grandma Susan's present had come in the mail. Cameron picked up the package and shook it. What could it be? A new video game? A remote control car? Maybe it was a cool blinking light for his bicycle. Cameron could hardly wait to open his birthday present from his Grandma Susan. She always gave the best gifts. Finally, the day arrived. Cameron flew out of bed and down to the kitchen, where his mother and father and baby sister were waiting for him. On his plate was a big stack of pancakes with candles sticking on the top. I wish this would be my best birthday ever. He closed his eyes and blew out the candles in one big breath. Can I open Grandma Susan's present now? If that's what you want, Mom said. Cameron tore off the paper and opened the box. A yellow envelope lay on top of the tissue paper. Read the card first, Mom told him. Inside was Grandma Susan's note. This is a very special gift for a very special boy. Happy birthday. Holding his breath, Cameron opened the box. It wasn't a video game. It wasn't a remote control car. It wasn't a blinking light for his bike. It was a sweater. A truly, terribly horrible sweater. Oh, Cameron, his mother said, look what Grandma knit for you. It's almost like the one she made for your baby sister. Cameron did not want a sweater for his birthday, even if his Grandma Susan had knitted it. His mother held it up for him to see. It had red, green, yellow, blue, and orange stripes. Even worse, it had big buttons. If his friends saw him wear this, they would laugh. It was a truly terrible, horrible sweater, and Cameron was never, ever going to wear it. The next day, Cameron called his dog Scout into his bedroom and closed the door. Carefully, he slipped Scout's front legs into the sleeves of his birthday sweater and buttoned the rest around Scout's middle. It had rained all night, and Scout loved rolling in the puddles. I'll never have to wear this sweater now, Cameron whispered to his dog. On Cameron's way out of the door, his dad stopped him. Whoa, Cameron, he said. Isn't that your new sweater? It's to keep you warm, not Scout. Besides, the backyard is a muddy mess. Slowly, Cameron took the sweater off Scout. Then one chilly morning a few weeks later, as his mother was making his lunch, she said, This would be a perfect day to wear your new sweater to school. Cameron went into his room and pulled out the sweater. He buttoned the big buttons, but it was a truly terribly horrible sweater, and Cameron was never, ever going to wear it. So before he even reached the bus stop, Cameron stuffed his birthday gift into his backpack, where none of his friends would see it. Just before Thanksgiving, Cameron had another chance to get rid of the sweater. I'm running some things down to the big church for the rummage sale, Mom called to him. Cameron, is there anything you want to donate? Cameron had an idea. Yes, he shouted. He grabbed the sweater, bolted down the stairs, and raced out to the car. Here, Mom, he said, and he tossed his bundle onto the trunk. His mother pulled out of the driveway, and Cameron smiled. Ha! That birthday sweater was gone for good. But when Mother came home, she was carrying the sweater. Look what I found mixed in with the rummage sale stuff. Thank goodness I saw it in time. Dragging his feet, Cameron carried the sweater back to his room. He buried it at the bottom of his closet next to his bike helmet. It was a truly, terribly, horrible sweater, and Cameron was never, ever going to wear it. Cameron knew his mother would find the sweater eventually, so he came up with another idea. One night when everyone was asleep, he sneaked down to the kitchen, carrying the sweater. He spread it out carefully and opened the refrigerator "Take this sweater." He squirted rivers of ketchup, then added globs of mustard. Finally, he scooped on piles of mayonnaise. Then he tossed the sweater into the laundry basket.
Oh,
The next morning, as his mother was leaving for the grocery store, he heard a shriek. "Cameron!" his mother yelled. "What happened to your sweater?" "Oh," Cameron said, trying not to smile. "I got hungry last night and made myself a snack." "Your special sweater is a mess," his mother told him. "Sorry, Mom," Cameron said. And he was sorry. Sorry he didn't like the sweater. Sorry that Grandma Susan had gone to so much trouble to knit him such a truly terribly horrible birthday gift. That night at dinner, the sweater was folded and lying on his chair. "Every single stain came out," Mom said happily. Grandma Susan would have been heartbroken if anything happened to the sweater. Baby Mia giggled and mashed peas into her hair. Cameron hadn't thought about that. He didn't want to make Grandma sad. Still, it was a truly horribly horrible sweater, and Cameron was never, ever going to wear it. In December, as Cameron was helping his dad with the Christmas decorations, his mother told him the news. "Grandma Susan is coming. She'll be here Saturday and stay with us until after Christmas. We're all going to the train station to pick her up." Mom looked directly at him. "And Cameron, she will want to see you wearing your sweater." Cameron was excited to see his Grandma Susan. She liked the same board games he did, and she let him read to her. Plus, she clapped really loudly when she watched him shoot hoops in the driveway. It would almost be worth wearing the truly terrible sweater just to be with her. So he put the sweater on when they went to pick her up at the train station. "Hello, hello," Grandma waved as she spotted them. "Grandma, Grandma," Cameron yelled and raced to meet her. Grandma Susan bent down and pulled him close. "I'm so glad you like your sweater. You look so handsome in it." Cameron frowned as he stared at the bright stripes and the big buttons. How could he look handsome wearing a truly terribly horrible sweater? The next morning, Grandma came into Cameron's room. The sweater was lying on the floor next to Scout. She picked it up and set it on the bed beside Cameron, spreading the sweater across his bedspread. "Let me tell you about knitting this sweater for you," she said. Her fingers traced the green stripe. "As I knit these, Rose, I imagined I was at one of your soccer games, watching you race across the grass. I remembered the time I saw you play. You kicked the winning goal, and everyone cheered." Cameron smiled. "No one cheered louder than you, Grandma." "And look at the blue ripple here. I chose that color because it's the same as your bicycle. Remember last summer when your dad took off the training wheels? You were scared, but you pedaled all by yourself, down the street for half a block. Then you phoned to tell me all about it. Blue reminded me that you are going far in life." Cameron looked up at his grandmother. "Can you guess why I used the orange yarn?" Grandma Susan asked. Cameron laughed. He knew why. "'Cause I love orange so much." His grandma nodded. "I've never seen a little boy who ate more oranges than you." "What about the yellow?" he asked. His grandma put her arm around his shoulder. "Yellow is the happiest color I know. I remember the day your mom and dad called me to tell me they had a baby boy. They were so excited and happy. Your mom and dad had waited a long time to have a baby. It didn't seem like it would ever happen, and then you were born. You, Cameron, are the sunshine of all of our lives." Cameron hugged his grandma tight. "Red, of course, is the color of hearts," Grandma said, "and you are always close to my heart, even when we're far apart." As Grandma bent to kiss the top of his head, Cameron looked again at the sweater she had knit him. He thought about the hours Grandma had spent choosing yarn and then knitting. This birthday present was one of a kind, special, just like his grandma. Suddenly, the sweater didn't look truly terribly horrible anymore. It looked good. It looked like something Cameron would be proud to wear for a very long time. And now look, if you check out this book, you can learn how to knit. And there's even a recipe, a pattern for the truly terribly wonderful sweater that Grandma knit. The end.
That's a wonderful story.
I like
How many
that.
times do you meet with people and knit at the library?
Oh, not enough. No. We meet once a week on Wednesdays and then once a week on Saturdays. So twice a week, and it's never quite enough. We love to knit.
And everyone's welcome, even if
Everyone is
don't know how
welcome,
to knit.
even babies,
even
well,
babies.
even little children, even old people, even anybody in between. It's great.
Excellent. Excellent. I want to read this book by Cynthia Rylant. She's one of my favorite writers ever. And this book is Snow, and the illustrator is Lauren Stringer. And it's beautiful. It starts out with one snowflake in a deep blue sky, and here it comes. Oh, Grandma and her granddaughter and their cat are looking out the window. More snowflakes are falling. Here we go. The best snow is the snow that comes softly in the night, like a shy friend, afraid to knock. So she thinks she'll just wait in the yard until you see her. This is the snow that brings you peace. And then there is the snow that begins to fall in fat, cheerful flakes while you are somewhere you'd rather not be. Maybe at school, maybe work. And this snow tells you as it falls that it will send you home early. Don't worry, home is where you need to be, and this snow will take you there. It will send you back over slippery white roads to the rooms you love so well, and it will say that it's all right to be happy. Yay! Some snows fall only lightly, just enough to make you notice the delicate limbs of trees, the light falling from the lamppost, a sparrow's small feet. And some snows fall so heavy they bury cars up to their noses and make evergreens bow and keep your kitties curled up a while. Children love snow better than anyone does, and they never complain as they pull on their red boots and mittens and make plans to catch wet snowflakes on their tongues. And roll their small bodies to the bottom of a hill. And the snow, while it is here, reminds us of this, that nothing lasts forever except memories. And while the snow is here, this brief moment, let's take a walk and see how beautiful the world is. And then come back to our white, quiet homes and make something warm to drink, and maybe read, or play a game, or talk to each other, tell each other all that we've been thinking. The snow is falling while the flowers sleep and the sun sleeps and the soft green gardens are waiting. It is the snow's turn now. The end. Oh, and there's one more picture. We will watch it fall. So beautiful.
Oh, that's so beautiful. I have another story about knitting. This is called Extra Yarn,
Oh, yay.
and it's by Mac Barnett and illustrated by John Klassen. Here we go. Extra yarn. On a cold afternoon in a cold little town, where everywhere you looked was either the white of snow or the black of soot from chimneys, Annabelle found a box filled with yarn of every color. So she went home and knit herself a sweater. And when Annabelle was done, she had some extra yarn. So she knit a sweater for Mars, too. But there was still extra yarn. And when Annabelle and Mars went for a walk, Nate pointed and laughed and said, "You two look ridiculous." "You're just jealous," said Annabelle. "No, I'm not," said Nate. But it turned out he was. And even after she'd made a sweater for Nate and his dog, and for herself and for Mars, she still had extra yarn. At school, Annabelle's classmates could not stop talking about her sweater. "Quiet!" shouted Mr. Norman. "Quiet, everyone! Annabelle, that sweater of yours is a terrible distraction. I cannot teach with everyone turning around to look at you." "Then I'll knit one for everyone," Annabelle said, "so they won't have to turn around." "Impossible," said Mr. Norman. "You can't." But it turned out she could. And she did. Even for Mr. Norman. And when she was done, Annabelle still had extra yarn. So she knit sweaters for her mom and dad, and for Mr. Pendleton, and Mrs. Pendleton, and for Dr. Palmer, and for little Louie. She made sweaters for everyone except Mr. Crabtree, who never wore sweaters or even long pants, and who would stand in his shorts in the snow up to his knees. "No sweater for me, thanks," said Mr. Crabtree. So she made Mr. Crabtree a hat. And even then, Annabelle still had extra yarn. She made sweaters for all the dogs and all the cats, and for the other animals too. Soon people thought, soon Annabelle will run out of yarn. But it turned out she didn't. So Annabelle made sweaters for things that didn't even wear sweaters. Things began to change in that little town. Knitting will change things. News spread of this remarkable girl who never ran out of yarn, and people came to visit from around the world to see all the sweaters and to shake Annabelle's hand. One day, an archduke, who was very fond of clothes, sailed across the sea demanded to see Annabelle. "Little girl," said the archduke, "I would like to buy that miraculous box of yarn, and I am willing to offer you $1,000,000. "No, thank you," Annabelle said, who was knitting a sweater for a pickup truck. The archduke's mustache twitched. "2,000,000, he said. Annabelle shook her head. "No, thanks." "10,000,000, shouted the archduke. "Take it or leave it." "Leave it," said Annabelle. "I won't sell the yarn." And she didn't. So that night the archduke hired 3 robbers to break into Annabelle's house, and they stole the box and took it to the archduke, who set off across the snow and sailed over the sea back to his castle. The archduke put on his favorite song and sat in his best chair. Then he took out the box, and he lifted the lid, and he looked inside. Ah! His mustache quivered, it shivered, it trembled. The archduke hurled the box out of the window and shouted, "Little girl, I curse you with my family's curse. You will never be happy again." But it turned out she was. The end.
I love that book.
I do too. And I think that is the end of our story time. Please come to the library. Come anytime you'd like. You can even come to our knitting group.
Good.
Wednesdays between 3:30 and 5, or Saturdays from 1 to 3. Just drop in anytime. We'd love to see you, and we'd love to talk to you about books and reading and other stuff. Goodbye.
Goodbye.